Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody in our audience. I'm Doug Silliman, the president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and I want to welcome you to today's program, Podcasting in the Middle East, a conversation with Kim Ghattas. Ms. Ghattas is a veteran journalist and author. She's been a reporter for the BBC, for the Financial Times, a commentator for the New York Times, CNN, NPR, and other media outlets. But most importantly for today, she is the host of the new podcast, People Like Us, which she does from Beirut, where she was born and raised. And you can find her full bio on AGSIW.org. Kim, welcome. We're very happy to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Now, the moderator and counterpoint for the discussion today is AGSIW Senior Resident Scholar, Dr. Hussein Ibish. Hussein is a weekly columnist for Bloomberg and The National, and you will see him and read him routinely on many other outlets in the US and Europe and around the world. Hussein, I turn the microphone over to you.
Oh, thank you, Doug. Kim, this is great. I've been waiting a long time to do this. You know, I heard about your podcast and I got so excited. I wanted to do an interview with you right away. And you convinced me to hold off. And that was probably a good idea because you've done quite a few episodes, I think 6 plus some bonuses, if I'm not mistaken, and they're all fantastic. And so I want to talk about that and also a little bit about some of your other work. You write regularly for The Atlantic as well, which is terrific. I think under Jeff Goldberg, it's become not only the best magazine in English language that I know of in the world right now, I think it's one of the best magazines in U.S. history. The current Atlantic is just,
absolutely,
it'd hold up against anything from the late 19th century through the heyday of great magazines in the 20s, 30s, 40s. It's a fantastic magazine. And it's because of writers like you. So let's begin, though, by talking about the podcast. And you have some good support for it. You partner with PRX. You have some other institutional support, which helps to make it a really polished product, which is really great, even though it has that immediacy and authenticity of a single guide. You're guiding your listeners through this complex maze. All right, but why don't you begin by telling us where the idea for the podcast came from? Why are you? What made you think of doing it? And what's the genesis of it?
Thanks again, Hussein, for having me. You're right that I try to hold off on this conversation because, like every project or even every article that we write or put out into the world, there's always this sort of slight trepidation about how is it going to be received.
Sure.
I have 20 years of experience in broadcasting. I had a long career at the BBC, both on television and on radio, but I felt that podcasting was yet something different, and it was a product that I was putting out really in my name, not as part of a bigger organization. Although, as you rightly point out, I do partner with Project Brazen, which is a fantastic startup, a boutique production house or studio, as they call themselves, based in London, that was co-founded by Bradley Hope and Tom Wright, who are the co-authors of Billion Dollar Whale. And if you haven't read that book, I highly recommend it. They launched a slew of projects, mostly investigative journalism, entrepreneurial productions that are narrative nonfiction based. And one of their biggest hits is, of course, Fat Leonard. And they came to me asking whether I was interested in doing a podcast. And I wasn't really. It took some convincing because I felt I needed a bit of time away from the world of broadcast after having done it for 20 years and having gone back to being just a writer. I mean, when I say just, I don't mean to belittle the writing. I just mean that just focusing on the writing, whether it's for The Atlantic or my book, Black Wave. I started in print with the Financial Times and a Dutch newspaper and a local paper in Beirut at the start of my career. And I really enjoyed going back to that world of sitting at your desk after having gone out to do the interviews and sitting down and writing it out and writing a whole book. I absolutely loved writing the book, but Bradley was quite insistent and he was right. And I said to him, I'm not so interested in nonfiction narrative because I feel I've done that most of my life, but I would be interested in a show that would focus on key themes which are of interest to people, not just in the Middle East, but everywhere. And then bring in people whose stories are powerful, who are out there making an impact, and bringing them into this wider conversation. So the tagline is, in a way, conversations about the Middle East, but for a global audience, because I wanted to give a platform for people in this region. But we can talk, of course, about all the other podcasts that are out there in a moment that are doing a fantastic job. And I wanted to make that conversation accessible to a global audience. And I wanted people to connect across borders on the same issue, because I think that what we have found over the last few years is that there is so much that binds us, whether we're dealing with impunity and accountability in the Middle East, or on Capitol Hill with the insurrection of January the 6th, whether we're dealing with climate change in Iraq and the rest of the Middle East, or in India or the US. We have a lot of common challenges and objectives and goals. And I think it's good to break down the walls and to see the Middle East not as this region over there, but to see where we connect, compare notes, and come out of this feeling richer of our knowledge, but also in a way more connected and therefore less alone in what is a very chaotic world.
Yeah, that's great. I think what you just did is sort of unpack the meaning of the title of the podcast.
Yes,
people like us. So it sort of struck me as I was listening to the episodes that, because it's a very open-ended sort of statement. People like us. Well, which people? What us? What's this like business? They're all very overdetermined words, right? And so what I ended up experiencing was a kind of a Russian doll effect, where the people like us at a certain point is, the Arabs or Middle Easterners, and then people who listen to podcasts and make podcasts, and the people who talk in the conversation that you're engaging in, which doesn't include everybody by any means, but it is available to everybody, and then sort of in concentric circles going out until it ends up including the whole world, and the sort of connectivity. People like us are who that people. All right. So, if you could talk a bit about how I'm sort of fascinated how you came up with the title, because it's sort of remarkably brilliant in condensing all those ideas in three little words full of valence.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, because it wasn't easy to come up with the name, and it happened, by happenstance. And I'll give credit where credit is due. But let me start with focusing just a little bit more for an instant on what I was trying to achieve, or what I'm trying to achieve with the show, which is something that I find is always at the heart of my work and has been my, North Star throughout my career as a journalist, which is, and is the reason why I became a journalist at the age of, after university or at university, and made the decision to become a journalist at the young age of 13. I grew up in the civil war in Lebanon, and there was a lot of coverage of this conflict. And somehow, as a young sort of, naive 13-year-old, I thought, if only people really understood what was going on here, if only they understood how we are like them, maybe the conflict would end. If I could explain it, then people would see it differently. Because you grow up in a country where that becomes associated with violence, with terrorism, with attacks, etc. And you're faced with these stereotypes as you go out, travel the world, etc., or in the headlines of the international media and so on. And so throughout my career, I've tried my best to explain things to a larger audience, which is fantastic when you're working at the BBC and you really have a very big global audience. And that global audience is what drove me to write my first book, The Secretary, explaining American foreign policy for a global audience, but explaining the world back to an American audience, and how those two intersect. And with Black Wave, I was trying also to show the incredible, not just the geopolitics and unpack that, but also show the incredible diversity within this region, which gets summarized to headlines about terrorists and tyrants. So the point, which may sound self-righteous, but really I think is about connecting, was really to include the Middle East in a broader conversation. In one of the book events that I held for Black Wave, I was in London, and one of the people who showed up was a policeman from Belfast who had read the book, and it came up to me and emailed me about it and said, I read your book and I feel like I'm reading about the Northern Ireland troubles.
Yeah.
And that kind of stayed with me. And he started saying, your Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi is this guy, and your Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is that guy, and your Hosni Mubarak is this other guy. And that kind of really stayed with me. So we could explain sectarianism in the Middle East in a way that is accessible to people who are dealing with another form of sectarianism. And instead of sort of looking at each other like the other, we could compare notes. And so that was kind of the driving thesis and idea behind the show. And then you start thinking about the title. And we had all sorts of, with my executive producer and with Bradley, we had ideas, crossings, parallels, intersection, whatever. And then I thought, okay, I need to go on a retreat to think about this and sit down and write something. And I went to, a nice a guest house outside of Beirut one weekend. I thought, I'm going to sit in the room for 2 days and just think about it. And I thought, oh God, I don't think that's the right way of doing it. So I was just sort of hanging out in the, by the fireplace, chatting to the other people who were there. And I mentioned I was, going to maybe come up with a podcast, and started talking about it. And so one of them said in Arabic, so you mean it's about nas u nas, which in Arabic is people and people. And I said, yeah, but I don't want it to be an Arabic name exclusively, because then you're excluding a wider audience that doesn't speak Arabic. So, another woman said, so you mean it's about people? I said, yeah, but we're not gonna call it People, because then it sounds like People magazine. And then she said, but you're talking, what you're trying to say is they are just like us. And I said, yes, that's it. So that was the people like us. And it's an interesting play on words, because it's about people like us. It's about telling others that we are like you. And at some point, if people realize that we're all connected and, we are not too dissimilar, we can actually start liking each other more. So the like can be in terms of comparison, but also in terms of a verb.
Yeah, no, it's really pretty brilliant. And I think we actually have just we haven't fully unpacked the meaning of the range of meanings in those three words, but we could get really bogged down in some kind of deconstructive doom loop. So let's not do it. But it is something that I keep thinking about as I listen to the episodes. I keep coming back to the title.
Yeah, because sometimes, Hussein, when I never get offended about comments that are stereotyping me. I try to take those comments and explain. So I've often had in the US reactions to my background, because people don't know necessarily that I'm Lebanese, or they don't know where I'm from, or they don't know that I grew up in a war. And then when they realize that, they say, oh wow, but you're so like us. I'm like, well, who's us and what is like, and why should I be different? So I try to explain, that we have so much in common. That I think, it sort of boils down to finding those connections, but mostly removing the Middle East from this box that it's in, this sort of silo where it gets discussed as this other region. Yeah. We are, of course, the center of the world.
Of course. No, you're right, and it's usually somehow a pathological center. It's pathologized for the most part, or fetishized. Either way is bad enough. So, what I wanted to kind of ask you about is the extent to which your show gets at trends developments, issues, problems, questions, really by delving into personalities. You take one or two or three people who are doing something or have done something or who are somehow engaged in an aspect of all of these dynamics, and you can do a deep dive with them, whether it's for the whole show or part of the show, and you let them tell their stories, right? And then through that, you illuminate certain aspects of this dynamic. Now, that is what you did in Black Wave. That's exactly what you did in Black Wave, right? And you're not the only journalist who uses this technique, but you're one of the best at it. There aren't that many who do it, but I think Bobby Worth does it,
absolutely.
at times. A
So
few
many
other
greats.
people. Other people do it, but you've kind of made it. It's becoming a trademark of your work, and it's really, really effective. So I'm wondering the extent to which the technique has migrated from articles, then the research you did for Black Wave itself, and now the podcast. Do you see any kind of a continuum in the technique of letting people tell their stories, or helping telling their stories in order to illuminate a part of these dynamics you're getting at?
I hadn't thought of it like that, but perhaps, you just summarized what I'm doing instinctively, because I've always liked to tell people's stories. And you're right that in Black Wave, the characters are at the center, but it's not necessarily about telling their whole biography, but about using snippets to illuminate a bigger issue. And in addition to that, I'm also always, maybe annoyingly for some, trying to make connections across borders, so for example, and comparing countries and states in a sort of way to say, we're not so dissimilar, whether it's, the article I wrote for The Atlantic in 2020, just before the Biden election, America's future might be Lebanon, whether it's discussing the concept of impunity and accountability, comparing the Middle East to America. And then, yes, in my books and now with this podcast, I really think that telling powerful stories is the best way to communicate complex issues and make it accessible to a global audience, or a wider audience.
It humanizes, right? It humanizes by going into an individual. It humanizes
without trivializing and without dumbing it down. I hold my audience in very high regard. I'm very much against simplifying to dumb down because, your readers won't get it. People get it. I get the most interesting comments from far-flung places.
By the way, I was going to ask you about that, because you urge people to give you feedback. So I was going to ask you, tell us about the feedback, because you're getting into it right now. So please go ahead.
The feedback's has been really great. And although it takes a while for a show to build its presence, it's a noisy world out there, and it was a pilot season. And as you experienced yourself, I was sort of hesitant about screaming it on the rooftops until it was out there and like, okay, it is working and people like it. The feedback's been great. Just this morning, I was speaking to a woman who was telling me about the names of the interviewees and telling me, I loved this one. And she loved, for example, listening to the Afghan woman, 29-year-old Ghattas in the first episode.
That really is a standout interview, by the way. It shines. Yeah.
And for me to hear reactions to specific interviews of people whose stories are being told in their own words in the podcast is really the best reward and the best compliment, because it's really about them. And I'm just trying to bring them together around the same theme. And for Black Wave, I had ice cream makers in Dublin and somebody in Brazil who'd never been to the Middle East. I think there is an appetite out there for smart content that is written or recorded in an accessible way for people who are interested in knowing more, but can't necessarily keep up with the day-to-day of the news and get overwhelmed by it. And it is a complex, overwhelming world. I mean, there's no end to, the catastrophes that this globe seems to be going through. And similarly to when I was growing up in Beirut, trying to make sense of it, I hope that it helps people who are listening or reading make sense a little bit of what is going on around us. And then the other episode that I loved, to which I got a lot of feedback, was, I can't remember, episode number 3 on Ukraine and Syria, and why there was such a outpour of support for Ukraine and such quick efforts to host Ukrainian refugees and pursue, in some ways, punitive actions against Putin and start talking about war crimes and pursuing him and his, people in international courts of justice, whereas, he'd been busy bombing Syria with Assad for a few years and nobody really seemed to care. But what I loved most about the guests in that episode was that they were not saying, the Syrian guest, Wafa Ali Mustafa, who's a refugee in Berlin, whose father is in prison in Syria and has been for 13 years, and they have no news about him. She wasn't saying the West is, full of hypocrisy, which, she might think, and, why do they care about Ukraine and why don't they care about us? Her take was more, I feel for Ukraine. They're going through what we went through. I want to support them. And how can we work together? And I think that's a more constructive approach rather than the outrage. She has the right to be outraged, and she is as well. But I thought that was such an incredibly mature take on what is such a difficult situation. And our Ukrainian guest, Olena Sotnik, had actually been warning since 2016 at the UN that the world should pay attention to Putin in Syria, because if not, he was going to come for others. And so it was really astounding to hear her speak and make those comparisons and say, we should stand in solidarity with each other.
Yeah, well, definitely, in retrospect, was a trial run in many ways for Ukraine, no doubt about it. It's interesting, though, that Russia is being pulled away from Syria because of the need to shift men and materiel to Ukraine, and then that, of course, leaves their putative partners, Hezbollah and Iran, in much deeper control and influence. But we'll get to all of that kind of thing later. What I wanted to, by the way, what newspaper did you write for? What local newspaper in Beirut did you write for?
So I started out at the Daily Star as an intern.
The late great Daily Star.
Yep. While I was still at university, and then I started stringing for the BBC, as they say, sort of as a freelancer, just sending in reports. I wrote for a Dutch newspaper, the Volkskrant, because my mom is Dutch, I speak Dutch. I was writing for them in English and they would translate it, but it was just great to have that connection. And actually, I started writing for the FT in 2000.
Great.
2002, I can't remember, maybe 2002 until about 2005, 2006. And it's really fantastic to sort of close the loop and now be writing opinion for them, which, I have a piece that just published today. So that's really great. And there is something really nice about seeing your name in print. We forget,
the physical print.
The physical print. The physical print, the actual paper.
Yeah. Whenever I go to the Gulf, I try to pick up a copy of the National that my article ran in, and bring it home and just look at it. It's interesting.
And you are really the master of making connections across issues and borders as well, Hussein. I read you avidly.
Well, it's very kind of you to say that. I don't know. I do. I mean, everything you say resonates with me, and I think there's a small group of us trying to do that, to talk to both sides simultaneously We try to
Without the
explain
finger,
it.
without the finger wagging, which is
No,
always
not at all.
what I find puts people off.
Without a doubt, without a doubt. So, what I wanted to kind of shift to for a second is the last aspect of the podcast I want to talk about before we kind of broaden the aperture a little bit and talk about issues and things that we can come back to the podcast. By the way, the Feltman interview was really, really great. He's a very interesting guy, very, very smart guy. And but the reason I mention him is not just that was a great interview and a good choice. It's also that in spite of the global consciousness that's baked into your program and this kind of universality that it aspires to, that's in that title, right? People like us, and that includes ultimately everybody. There is not only an Arab flavor to this, there is a Lebanese and a Beiruti voice that comes through loud and clear.
I'm trying not to be biased. I'm really aware of that, especially for second
But
season.
it's great. But I mean, I love it because where else am I? By the way, where in Beirut did you grow up? What part of Beirut did you live in the 80s?
Oh, goodness. I grew up really on the front line.
Yeah.
In Beirut, in a neighborhood. I don't know who's listening and who knows how well they know Beirut, but it was called Galerie Sam'an, named after an infamous
you really were right there
next door. And the neighborhood we were in was called Hayy al-American, the neighborhood, the American quarters. I have no idea why. I think lots of foreigners living there before. And when my parents first moved there, just before the war, it was this beautiful area in the suburbs. It would be like moving to Alexandria, Alexandria,
DC,
across the water, and olive groves, orange groves, etc., gardens, and then it became just this sort of no man's land that we lived in, and somehow didn't leave until almost the end of the war, and we have this incredible raw footage, well, not raw, but incredible footage of TV reports done about my family at the start of the war in 76. And when I see this footage, I thought, wow, I remember, but I've forgotten. And then you're suddenly face to face with it. And it's quite striking. But yes, there is a Lebanese flavor. I mean, I can't sort of, I am Lebanese. I'm quite proud of it. I record everything from Beirut in my little, office here. It's all done online. We are an incredible team of mostly, I think all women, mostly women, except for the sound engineer. Credit goes to Project Brazen for insisting on hiring from the region. So I do want to give them great kudos for that. We have a fantastic social media manager, Noor Abdul Latif, a fantastic researcher, producer, Farah Baba. Our executive producer for the first season was Jane Beresford, who's a great colleague of mine from the BBC. And it's just a great sort of team to work with. But most importantly, Hussein, I do want to say something about the music and the design. The music is by Haig Papazian, the violinist of Mashrou' Layla. And I think it's just such a addictive tune. And the design is by Jamal Saleh, a fantastic multidisciplinary artist, graphic design graduate of AUB in Beirut, who's one of the co-founders of one of the most successful startup news platforms in Lebanon called Megaphone. So the identity really also comes together thanks to their input and their vision for the show.
So what I was going to thank you for all of that. I was going to pick up on what you said about looking at the footage, from 76 in your family and saying, well, the kind of cognitive dissonance or dissociative effect of looking back at something, or even living through something somewhere and looking at it from the outside. So, for example, during the 70s and early 80s, I was in and out of Beirut. I was there and then I wasn't there, and then I was there and I wasn't there. From the outside, it looked one way, and living in it felt very different. And even in a week, like you'd be there for a week, right? And it would feel one way. And then you go, somewhere else, Cyprus or something, for a week or two, and it looks different and entirely worse, by the way. And then you go back and suddenly you're living it in a different way. And what I wanted to ask you is, what's it like in Beirut right now? From the outside, and I haven't been there since the implosion of the economy and the port explosion and all that. The impression one gets is of Venezuela on the Mediterranean, of a society that just can't function, of a country where you'd go to the airport and it would be all in the dark with flashlights and candles and things because they can't light the thing, where Télé Liban is not broadcasting the World Cup because they can't afford it. Things like that, you know. And I'm just wondering, what's it like in Beirut now? And then also, if you can, this is asking a lot, it's packing a lot into one question, but what's it like to do a podcast from a Beirut that is without doubt in crisis?
Yeah, and I'll add the third element to that, or maybe that's your follow-up question. I do want to talk about the podcasting scene in the Middle East, because we should mention.
That's going to be the follow-up, but you can just pack it all in.
I'll start with that. Look, I was born into the war, and I remember parts of it, not all of it. I was very young, but I remember a lot of it. And there is a cognitive dissonance with a lot of people about what we lived through and how quickly we tried to put it behind us, because it was unresolved and because there was no national reconciliation, because none of the problems were fixed. It was a piece of the victor, which were the Syrians who, took over, the whole of Lebanon, imposed Pax Syriana, and, that was it. So there's a lot that is still simmering under the surface. And I think that what we're going through today, if I had to be sort of very like a cold observer from the outside, is the last sort of death throes of that system, which was never dismantled after the civil war. You still have the same people, the Nabi Hibirris, the Michel Aoun, even the president, who's not a warlord, but was, the last war leader of in charge in 89, 1990.
The last great sectarian Zayn guy, yeah.
So he was our army commander who, absolutely wanted to, become president again. So anyway, that's a whole different session. But, Jumblat, they're all still there. The system is still there, if you want to call it the deep state or whatever you want to call it.
No, the system. I think the system's a good word for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that what we're seeing today is the undoing of that. And we're in this sort of strange interregnum, and I don't know what comes next, but I don't think they can hold on, if only because they're getting older and there's no real transition to a new generation. Gibran Bassil, the son-in-law of On, he's not on. The son of Walid Jumblat, Drew's leader of the PSP, is really not Jumblat. And Nabi Birri doesn't have anyone to take over except maybe his wife. But it's just the next phase is not going to look the same. And so it's a moment, it's an inflection point, and I think they're all aware of it, which is why they're now trying to bargain over all the positions that are going to come vacant over the next year. Already the presidency is vacant, and next year you're going to have the army chief, the security chief, and the governor of the central bank. So there's a whole grand bargain that is being discussed at the moment, which is why it's taking so long. And I write about it in my FT piece today, because they're trying to ensure that they can somehow hold on to the system, which benefits their bank accounts very much, and do that for the long term. They're not thinking just for the 6-year term of a new president. They're really thinking for the next generation. So that's quite interesting. And, it's another topic as well, but that's a moment for the US to really look at Lebanon and think, what do we want to try to achieve here, aside from a quick compromise? So living through it, of course, is very different. It's painful. It is distressing. It can be depressing. I made a very conscious choice to stay. I was living in DC for 10 years. I came back to Lebanon for 6 months to write my book. And then I decided to stay a little bit longer. Then the crisis happened. And I made a choice to stay for various reasons, some personal, some just professional, and some just because I felt that, it sounds odd, but I felt this was where I had to be. And I don't regret that decision a minute, but it hasn't
It
been
doesn't
easy.
sound like it.
It hasn't been easy. And of course, I'm amongst the privileged in the sense that I have connection to the outside world. I have a foreign passport. If I had to suddenly get on a plane and go to Washington, I'm hoping somebody will, will hire me if I had to find a job. So I have options. And maybe it's because I have options that I thought I had to stay. Because if I had lost all my savings, like everybody else in the economic financial crash here, if I did not have a second passport, I would probably be lining up at an embassy somewhere to beg for a visa and then get any job I can to reconstitute myself in my 40s, which I see a lot of my friends having to do. They're in their 40s and 50s, they work their whole life, they're starting to look towards retirement, and suddenly everything is yanked away from them. And those are the middle class, upper middle class people, professionals. So just think how hard it is for people who are barely, making ends meet, who are left to fend for themselves in a country where there is no social network, no, proper healthcare system to take care of people. At the same time, and where this injustice of having gone through 15 years of war, having to rebuild yourself, somehow managing, thriving mostly to some extent, and then suddenly finding going through this whiplash of having it all yanked away from you. The lack of horizon is what really hurts. Even when you're in a civil war, you're like, well, when it ends, we can rebuild, it'll get better. But now no one can see how this gets better. Having said that, we are not Venezuela in two ways. One, we don't have the oil. No matter what people think about the maritime border deal, this is not going to, fill our coffers with billions of dollars. In any case, not anytime soon. And second, I find that there is still a surprising amount of social cohesion and community and solidarity in this country. I walk on the streets of Beirut. There are no lights, but I'm not afraid. I'm probably more comfortable and I feel safer walking on the streets of Beirut than I do on the streets of Washington or New York. There's a lot of social community support for each other. There is no breakdown of civil order in a country where the police and the army have had their salaries slashed dramatically by devaluation and inflation. So I find that quite extraordinary, and there is something to investigate about how that works. And so going back to your question about how does it look from the outside and how does it feel on the inside, when I leave Lebanon for a couple of weeks, I start panicking. I'm like, oh my God, this looks really bad. I have to go back. What's going on? The dollar is going down, up. I hear that. And then you come back and you think, oh, okay, well, it's kind of, same. So we have to think maybe a little bit about how media coverage works and what impressions it gives. I remember that, not to belittle the crisis. It is disastrous in so many levels. It is undoing this country at the seams, and the institutional decrepitude that is settling in because government employees are not being paid enough and they're leaving, they're not showing up, you can't get anything done, judges are on strike, the equivalent of the DMV is sort of shut down, and yet somehow it functions. I don't have the answer. One day maybe, I'll write a book about that.
I mean, I think it sounds like an opportunity for a great podcast, by the way. So, bear it in mind. Far be it for me to tell you what to do. By the way, I'd like to tell the audience that you can ask a question by using the Q&A function, and I'd encourage you to do that if you want. Let's follow up with the podcasting scene in the Middle East, in the Arab world. There's a sort of new generation of news, Middle East related, Arab related news and information, I'm trying to look for other organs, I suppose. I mean, venues. There's things like your podcast. There's in English, there's New Lines, which is here in the US, which is very good and interesting. There's a whole bunch of magazines and journals, including literary ones and political ones. in English, in French, in Arabic. There's a sort of explosion of decentralized, non-institutional or quasi-institutional, some things like your work, which in the podcast has support, but I'm assuming you do what you want. I mean, it's generated by you for it, and so it's really sort of a your partners are basically supporting you and enabling you to do what you
Correct.
conceptualize, and you're talking with them and all that, but it's your product, and that's really the work of one person with support. And this is new. This is very different and multilingual and multifaceted and in multimedia, many different media. I mean, why don't you tell us about that, what you know about it and what you think about it, and where you see your podcast fitting in to this new flowering of this phenomenon of information.
So the phenomenon is a reaction to the devastation in the media landscape in this region. It's really taken a hit, a little bit like, the media newspaper scene in Middle America has been decimated by, for various reasons. And now, the big papers on the coast on either coast are rediscovering the need to do more reporting locally. But also it's a combination of factors. The business model is broken. In the Middle East, political monies, has had a big impact on the quality and what is out there, and then also on what is no longer out there. I mean, if you think about big papers like Al Hayat newspaper, which is no longer really functioning, in Lebanon, newspapers like
Daily Star is gone.
The Daily Star is gone. As-Safir is gone. So there is really a vacuum in some ways, and then you have news organs that are dominated by the state or by political money. And the young generation isn't really connecting with that. So they want something different. And in a way, you could argue I'm very late to the show. There are many podcasters out there in the Arab world who are doing some really fantastic work, who were the trailblazers. I'm in a way following in their footsteps. You have Kerning Cultures, which does a series of Arabic shows, but also some great content in English, Kerning Cultures, where they do mostly narrative nonfiction. And I highly recommend all of their shows, some of which are presented by, or some episodes, some of them are presented by Dana Balut. And then you have Mikey Muhanna from Afikra, which means by the way in Arabic, play on the word of with thought, fikra. And he started, 5-7 years ago with an idea around presenting on topics that are little known, forgotten, interesting, topics that people are curious about, a question they've always had, why do we eat manaish? Where does that come from? And so these presentations then led to, doing podcasts around some of these issues and building a community around Afikra. And he does events around the world where there is Arab diaspora, and he does some great podcast interviews that he invited me on as well. So I highly recommend that. Then you have an incredible show hosted by Medea Azouri and Mu'in Jaber called Serde After Dinner, Chit Chat After Dinner, which is in a very Lebanese fashion, meant to be in Arabic, but mixes in a lot of the English and French because we just, mix all our languages. And that's having a huge success. They're in the top 1%, or they've reached the 1% of movers and shakers in Apple Podcasts, which is great. Then you have SOWT, SOWT, which is coming out of Jordan, founded by Ramzi Tesdel, and they do some great shows and nonfiction, mostly in Arabic. They're starting to do some things in English, starting to translate some of their episodes in English in one particular podcast that it's called Loosely Adapted, which is really quite good. So there's a lot of quality broadcast content that is coming out there. And I think that's just fantastic because there is so much to say about this incredibly vibrant region with music, talent, writers, poets, activists, musicians. It coincides also, I think, with a rediscovery of Arab identity, or a different approach to the discussion about Arab identity and Arab culture in the US, with the Mo Amer doing the Mo series on Netflix, with a lot of Arabic music in the clubbing scene in New York that is not just catering to the Arab diaspora, but more and more just, people from everywhere in the US. A lot more use of, ingredients from this region in the cuisine. It's cool to use za'atar, it's cool to use sumac, etc. So I think, there is a moment, we are at a moment where we can have a more constructive, more positive, more engaging conversation. And I think where I come in is kind of, late to the show, as I said. And, I've tried to add to the scene, and I get a slightly different exposure because of my time in Washington. So, I get the access, I get, interviewed by you, I get a tweet by Hillary Clinton, recommending the show. And I'm hoping that opens the space for others to also then be recognized and listened to in a wider audience than just the Middle East.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's right. You're not a pioneer in this, but I don't think you're late to the party either. I mean, you are the first really prominent Arab journalist and public intellectual who has gone into systematic podcasting. So you've kind of taken it to another level in terms of content, in terms of your profile and your the access you bring because of your role and your prominence, but also then the how polished it is, which is something different because you've got the support. And
for 20 years at the BBC will do that to you.
Yeah, for sure. And
production quality.
And your team, yes, you know what you're doing, and your team is good, and so it's a little different. It has a very polished feel to it, which is great. I mean, and so the rawness of some of the early stuff, or some of the stuff, the chit chat stuff, is great. Also, it has its own, immediate authenticity, and it's fun and it pulls you in. But I think you've taken it to another level, and I think you're right. I think it invites more, right? And for sure that I think that's true.
And so you're asking me, for the second season. I think what we want to do is get a little bit more feedback, and this is great for me as well, Hussein, to be talking to you and then seeing some of the questions. We want to be a little bit more flexible with the format. I love the 3 voices around one issue, but sometimes we could do 2 voices, or we could do more one-on-one in-depth interviews with the right people. I think that we could, I want a better balance between current and evergreen. So I don't want to do a news show, because you have great news shows out there, but I want to continue to connect across borders and across issues. But one of the issues we faced, for example, is that we had the podcast kind of the first season kind of almost in the bag, and then Iran happened, and I couldn't adjust quickly and do an episode about Iran. And I would have done it by perhaps bringing in people from the region to discuss the issue from different perspectives, or maybe, something across Iran's sphere of influence, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran. So I want to be a bit more nimble so that we can do some evergreen issues, like we'll do climate change, but we'll also do, some of the topics of that period, but always from a broader perspective, bringing in more people. Maybe some episodes might be slightly shorter, and then some probably a longer season, more than 6 episodes.
Yeah, I mean, it did seem like 6 was sort of a fairly short run, designed precisely to develop the show as a podcast, to get the format right. And to really kind of perfect the framework. And then, once you have that down in the first season, then it's a pilot. I mean, I think you said,
and you
I think the whole
establish your
thing-
identity, your presence, and then you go back to the drawing table and you refine it.
So the whole thing was a pilot. So now it will be easier for you to use the framework you've created and do more, longer seasons. In other words, with more podcasts on a wider range of topics. What I think is really great is the way you kind of combine culture, society, and the political. But the political, you're doing, sort of 30,000 feet up. You're doing a very, very broad aperture. You haven't done, even with Feldman, right? It was very sort of, how are decisions made in Washington? What's the, very big picture stuff. You haven't gotten into anything granular at the political level. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts of doing that, because that would be a very different feel, right? That gets you closer to a news show, which, as you say, is not lacking. I understand why you'd stay away from it, because you could say, where's the value added in that, right? But I'm just wondering if you think it's something you might tackle from time to time, and what might you do? I don't know.
So I think you're right that some of it is sort of 30,000 feet, and then some of it is actually very granular. I mean, when you're talking to Olena Sotnik in Kiev about, what they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, it's both the geopolitics of trying to go after Putin, and then her day-to-day in Kiev without power, trying to figure out how to keep her mother safe. But I see what you mean with the conversation about with Feldman, about with Jeff, about the geopolitics. He's out of office, so I thought it would be interesting to explore with him how it works.
Yeah.
And every episode, every season will have different, one-on-ones with people of the sort of Jeff Feldman, but also I'd like to bring in newsmakers, current officials, etc. And I haven't quite thought through how some of these interviews would work, because you don't want them to become outdated.
Right.
If you're not putting them out the second day, like you're, on the Christian Amanpour show or the Fareed Zakaria show, they're out, they're current, they're now. You want to find the right balance of granular but 30,000 feet. So you could, talk to somebody like Brett McGurk and ask him, what drives the Biden administration's policy towards the Middle East today. But it has to stay slightly a look behind the headlines rather than following the current news development. So there would be no point me almost even asking, if I were to, if I would have interviewed him for Brett McGurk or other officials of the Biden administration, Tim Lenderking or Jake Sullivan, whoever, if I'd asked them, how do you feel currently about the US-Saudi relationship in the wake of the OPEC decision? By the time it comes out, it's kind of outdated. So we're trying to keep that balance. But also because of, my Rolodex and, my exposure, I can get some of the bigger names onto the show, but I think it would be a look behind the scene and a big picture interview rather than what is happening today.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So that's really helpful, and what it does is it sets you up to look at some things. But I think you're right. I think it would be pointless for you to do a show about a current moment that is going to be fleeting, right? It's got to be something with a long shelf life to fit into your format and to do the work that you're doing. So I think
also because I find that it adds something to the conversation. Do we really need another expert on this show to talk about OPEC today? You have the incredible Gideon Rahman, who does fantastic weekly look at the news, and I can't outdo what he does. I don't have, I'm not doing that kind of show. So I always think, what do I add? What is my, special
value added? Yeah.
Value added, and so that's always what drives me. And
No,
Gideon Rahman, of course, is a columnist at the Financial Times, and people should definitely stay smart and listen to him too.
Oh, he's brilliant.
And you.
Yeah, no doubt about it. No. He's very, very good. I agree. But I do want to kind of explore what I think is a pitfall in some of your approach, which I love. All right, but if I were to go back to Black Wave, I think it's a great book. I love it. It was a New York Times bestseller. It deserved to be. It was applauded, and it's a fantastic, contribution. And I love the way you explored the impact of the Saudi-Iranian rivalry and competition, sectarian weaponization of sectarianism by these governments, and how it impacted societies around the region. I think it was great. The question I have is sometimes when when you're doing this connection and equivalence and balance thing, it doesn't always work completely for me. And one area where, and I think your book came close to recognizing this, but never fully did, is that when you look at the impact of Saudi sectarianism, which has changed a lot in the last 3, 4 years, 5 years, but it still is what it is, and it had the impact it did, since '79. I like your focus on '79. I used to give lectures back in 22 years ago, 23 years ago, which were called 1979. So I also fetishize that year. Yeah. I never wrote it up, but I used to went all over the country talking about 1979, but I think there's a way in which the Iranian impact on the region has had a negative effect, a pernicious effect that the Saudi role has not. And it's this network of non-state actors, these armed gangs. Saudi Arabia doesn't do that, not because Saudi Arabia is better, but because when they... No, it does know how to. It experienced it in Afghanistan. When you unleash the Sunnis like that, they turn into Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and they want to go after the kingdom immediately, and they can't control it. They can't control it for many different reasons. There's the lack of the clerical hierarchy, the lack of the marj'i thing. There's also the fact that these guys go completely nuts, and so they have tried it, and it created Al-Qaeda, and then they never got it back in the bottle. So they don't do that. And my point here is simply that there isn't the equivalent in Saudi Arabia of the IRGC Quds Force. There was no Qasim Soleimani of Saudi Arabia. There is no PMFs and Hezbollah and all the Fatima brigades and all these brigades in Syria and what have you, and the Houthis and all of that. And those groups are cancerous, right? They really sit in these societies and prevent this. They're the single biggest factor, in my view, in why Lebanon and Iraq and some of the other countries in question cannot even begin to get to the reform thing, because these guys are willing to shoot people who want to reform a system that they take advantage of. And so I think that's one area where the balance just doesn't work. And I wanted to see what you thought about that.
I don't disagree with your perspective and your feedback or analysis of the difference between them. And I do address that at some point in the book. The difference between the two is exactly as you say, that the Saudis launch into something, they get the genie out of the bottle, and they can't bring it back in. They can't rein it in because these groups don't answer to a higher authority in Saudi Arabia. And that is sometimes almost more dangerous because no one has control over these groups, from Al-Qaeda to ISIS. They're kind of all the progeny of some form of Saudi proselytization and checkbook diplomacy. And I think the Saudis should take responsibility for that, even if they're not a central authority that guides this. So that was part of what I described in the book. And I think that the impact on society and culture across the region, from Pakistan to Egypt, has been also, aside from the militant group has been great in terms of the money that flowed into the more conservative trends of culture and society and religion. And that is also very hard to roll back.
Yeah.
With the Iranians, absolutely, these groups answer to Khamenei, the funding, the money, etc. They have some local autonomy. I don't think Hassan Nasrallah calls, the Iranians every day to say, what should I do today or what should I say tomorrow? But they're on the same page. And if somehow suddenly tomorrow Khamenei said, okay, boys, we're done here. You can cease and desist now. Some of these groups would continue. They have their own sources of funding, etc. They're armed to the teeth, but suddenly they would be out alone in the trenches and there'd be nobody backing them up. And you're absolutely right that the impact and the hold they have on countries like Iraq and Lebanon is nothing like the hold Saudi Arabia can have on most of its allies. I mean, look at when they wanted to launch a war into Yemen, the Pakistanis said, forget it. And the Egyptians said, no, thank you, barely participated. So you can never, ever compare two things completely equally. But I think that the social and cultural impact of what the Saudis did over the 80s and 90s is really quite tremendous. And it is visible to the eye.
Oh, no doubt.
The devastation of what the Iranians are doing with their proxy militias is terrible to watch. It is violent. People get killed for standing up to the Iranians in Lebanon and in Iraq and in Syria. They are changing the demographics of countries like Syria. They are deploying militias and building states within states. They don't believe in governance. And as my good friend Karim Sajadpour at the Carnegie Endowment always says, they are building an axis of misery. And getting out of that axis of misery requires a lot of courage, a lot of work, requires regional not action, but movement, requires international cooperation of some sort. I mean, Hezbollah is no longer just a local militia. They're a regional paramilitary force. But the Saudis also need to take responsibility for their inability to play the game. They play the game terribly. They get upset, they slam the door, and they walk away. And who fills the vacuum? Not that I would like to see a constant competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia in Lebanon, but if the Saudis walk out, they can't say, oh, well, Iran is, completely in control of Lebanon. Well, yeah, you just walked out.
They keep doing it. And they've done it like 4 or 5 times in Lebanon over the past 25 years. And in Iraq, they keep doing it too. They get frustrated that they're and they give up on everybody and walk away. And then a few years later, they realize they have no choice and they come back and they try again. And it just and there's a lack of long-term vision here.
Well, it's a sort of we do this today, but we do that tomorrow. There's no continuity, no consistency. And King Abdullah made Saad Hariri go to Damascus to visit his father's own, alleged assassin.
Right.
And I find it really difficult then to have a conversation with my Saudi friends who blame everything on the Lebanese for failing to stand up to Hezbollah. Well, you need to take responsibility for some of the decisions that you took as However,
the counter question is with what? With what the expectation on the Lebanese allies of Gulf countries has been completely unrealistic. And I've been arguing with them about this for a decade. What do you want these guys to do? What with the resources they have? Get real. But
what I would want to say is that on this sort of competition and the cultural impact, I do find it incredible and stunning to see the social cultural changes within Saudi Arabia. Not to shy away from criticism of the sometimes petulant and sometimes vindictive policies and violent reactions against dissidents, including Jamal Khashoggi. But we have to acknowledge that for Saudi society and for the young generation of Saudi Arabia, the transformation is astounding. And kudos or credit to the understanding within the royal family or MBS alone or his advisor or whoever, for understanding they had to diffuse that time bomb of a young generation that is bored, that is, feels oppressed culturally, because there is still a climate of fear in Saudi Arabia. But when you look at Iran today and what they're rebelling against, you can look at Saudi Arabia and say, wow, he diffused that just in time.
Yeah. Do you think that the social reforms, I mean, look, there's no doubt. I mean, the social revolution in Saudi Arabia in the past 5-6 years is so quick and so dramatic. You probably have to go back to Japan in the Meiji era, in the late 19th, in the 1870s, 1880s, to find a country that transformed that quickly, socially, in my view. But anyway,
you also have to look at Iran and the White Revolution.
I want to ask you about that. But so you've got this in Saudi Arabia, you've got this great socioeconomic opening up, cultural opening, but then this constriction into a far more authoritarian, far more centralized, far more politically repressive state, in order probably to try to contain the forces that are being unleashed socially. But when it comes to Iran, do you think that looking at Saudi Arabia and looking at the transformation in Saudi Arabia has had any effect on the Saudis who are, on the Iranians who are out there protesting for freedom, especially from the fashion police, literally?
I have no indication of sort of direct impact, and also because when I was in Iran briefly in 2015, and whenever I visited Saudi Arabia, I was always very intrigued to see that they barely knew anything about each other.
Right.
So it's not like they're looking at the other country to say, hey, what's going on there? What's going on? They know very little about each other. However, I think that the headlines that Saudi Arabia is making with, raves in the desert and museums opening up and cinemas and, women going to football stadiums and concerts and women drive. I mean, women in Iran have always been able to drive. Yeah. I think that must be trickling down somewhere. And Iranians must be seeing that also because of the TV station, a cable TV or satellite channel, Iran International, which is most probably funded by the royal court and has a definite agenda of showing not just what is happening inside Iran to Iranians, but also of making a point of showing what's happening in Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis had a festival of Persian nights in Al-Ula in 2020. And that was an opportunity for famous Persian Iranian artists to come and perform. And that was then beamed back into Iran. So I'm guessing, but I have no evidence that some of that is sort of being seen and heard, and people are thinking about it and thinking, why not us? But, Iranian could look at any other country around the world and say, why not us, right? Because they're living through something that is just, they want to move into the future, and this geriatric leadership of theirs is keeping them in the past.
Right. No, I agree with you. I've always been very skeptical. I ask you the question because I'm a skeptic. You hear this from Saudis, friends of the Saudis, etc. And I just don't think that the Iranians who are demonstrating for freedom need any comparisons. I think they just live their reality and they don't.
Also, I mean, let's not. Let's give Iranians agency. I mean, they've been protesting this regime for 40 years.
Exactly.
They protested in the 90s, even when Khatami was there. They protested in 2009 against, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's election. They protested in 2017, 2019. This time, I think, is different. But also, I think it's because 40 years after 1979, 42 years by now, I think the system is running out of steam. It doesn't have anything new to offer. It cannot regenerate itself. And so it's this sort of turning points, moment of inflection that I think was inevitable, which I think I allude to at the end of Black Wave.
You do.
And I
you
said,
do.
you know,
you do.
it's coming to an end.
You set it up very nicely, and it's in the conclusion of your book. The essay, that's the best part, by the way. The best passage in the book is the conclusion, where you sum everything up, and you give people glimpses of what may be coming, and you totally do kind of set up the current Iranian rebellion. But the thing we haven't seen in Iran, we've seen protests for freedom, like this one, hijab based, but it could be anything. It's basically a freedom protest. And then we've seen protests like the last big one, which were bread protests. They were about water and jobs and bread and electricity. And what we have not seen is a combination of Iranians who want to protest for freedom and Iranians who want, economic
and that's now
protest.
all coming together.
Middle class and working class coming together. We just haven't seen that. And that, I think, would be, the one thing that the regime couldn't put up with. But I wanted to ask you, we do have this Iranian-Saudi dialogue in Iraq. We do have a UAE-Saudi dialogue, which is even more advanced and began earlier because UAE is smaller and has less, it moves more nimbly because it has less of a role, and I'm just wondering if you think there's a real potential for the de-escalation within the Arab world and between Arabs and Turks, with the kind of collapse of the Brotherhood as kind of the basis of that. Is there any way out of the Iranian Gulf Arab, especially Saudi, sort of confrontation, or are we just going to live with this for the next 25, 30 years or something? I mean,
I don't think that at the moment, I don't think that at the moment, I might be wrong, but I don't foresee that this is a time when Gulf countries want to reconcile or have a détente with the regime in Iran. I might be wrong. I think they might be thinking this is a time to push for concessions or to stand at a distance and watch this unravel without saying too much, because you never know how it actually pans out. So I suspect
they have been pretty quiet about these demonstrations, haven't they? So
yes, I wrote a piece about that in The Atlantic.
Yeah, that's right. You did. No, thank you for reminding me.
Because I think the Saudis learned a lesson in 1979 when they supported the Shah until the last minute because he was their friend, and then they were very worried about a pro-Soviet government coming in his stead, so they were worried about the Shah's departure. And then when they saw the outcome, first they accepted the result of popular uprising, and then they welcomed Khomeini as a man who spoke their language, the Quran, Islam, Sharia, etc. And they said they looked forward to cooperation. So I think they feel kind of traumatized by that, to realize that he actually turned into their arch nemesis. So I think they're going to stay very quiet until they know how this turns out, and until they really test it. And it might turn out that nothing changes, and that the repression becomes incredibly violent in Iran, and that there is no possibility for change of any kind, not even with a change within the system to try to hold on by presenting a different face. There are many more Iran experts who can talk about this much more wisely than me. I think that there are two scenarios: an Egypt style scenario where the army steps in and tells Mubarak, I think you should step aside, otherwise we're going to lose everything. And of course, in Iran, it would look a little bit different because you don't have just one army. Right. Or unfortunately, I worry about the Syria scenario where they fight to the death and it destroys the country. But I think they're smarter than that. I don't think even that regime would wish it for itself. I do think that they will brandish that threat of a potential, all-out conflict to call for a lessening of the pressure or for dialogue with their neighbors.
Right. Okay, that's really helpful. I think what we're looking at maybe is an effort by these countries to get security by participating both in the quietly in the new regime of containment and deterrence that the United States is building post JCPOA on the one hand, and then having these dialogues and try to balance it that way. And that's sort of a this dual policy of outreach and containment at the same time, which is really a trick, but I guess they don't feel they have a choice. So we're running out of time. We are over time, but I do want to end by, first of all, by thanking you so much for joining me. It's been wonderful. And I want to give you an opportunity to tease season 2 of People Like Us, because it's just such a fantastic addition to the conversation. It's completely unique. And I want to congratulate you on just another fantastic piece of work here. In addition to your writing, the podcast is amazing. So tease season 2.
Very humbling, Hussein. Thank you. I really appreciate that. We're just in the process of thinking through how we put together season 2. What I can say is that it will be more of the same, but better and different, but better and longer, let's say, in terms of the length of the season. I want to bring in more voices, more diversity across the region, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Pakistan, and also have more voices from outside the Middle East so that we can compare notes. Should we talk about political change in the region, why we're not able to really achieve that, and then talk to people in Chile and how they got there, talk about corruption in the region and compare notes with the son of the Maltese journalist who was assassinated in a car bomb, Daphne Caruana Galizia. Have more conversations with a few bigger names as well, to get more people on the show, but mostly I want to maintain this sort of accessibility, keep it focused on people who have great stories to tell, who are out there doing great things, and continue to focus on themes that are of interest to people, in an international audience. I have to say that I'm also writing another book. Yeah. And so that will take a few years before it comes out. So the podcast will keep listeners and
keep us all going until then. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
all right. Well, listen, Kim, thank you so much for joining me. Congratulations on the podcast, and let's do this again before too long.
Absolutely. Okay? Anytime.
Wonderful.
Thanks so much.
Please join us next time.